The stale air in the cubicle maze, ceiling tiles water-stained, one phone ringing always tasted of old coffee and forgotten ambition. I sat, as I always did, beneath a flickering fluorescent panel that hummed a low, persistent note, a dirge for the day. My keyboard clicked out a rhythm of meaningless data entry, each stroke a small, dull echo in the vast, gray expanse of my existence. It had been months since I'd felt anything beyond a dull ache, a persistent emptiness that had settled deep in my bones after the last one left, after the last connection snapped. The phone, the one still ringing, was not mine. It belonged to the desk 3 rows over, long abandoned by a colleague who had one Tuesday simply not returned. No one had bothered to disconnect the line. The sound was a constant, low-level irritant, a reminder of something unfinished, unheard. I traced the intricate patterns of a water stain above my head, a sprawling map of forgotten leaks and slow decay mirroring the landscape of my own mind. My fingers paused over the plastic keys. I didn't know what I was typing anymore. The words blurred into a meaningless stream of symbols. My life had become a series of careful omissions. I omitted social gatherings, omitted phone calls, omitted any attempt to fill the gaping void that had swallowed my past. The apartment I rented, a pale box overlooking a brick wall, felt less like a home and more like a temporary holding cell. Each morning the same routine: lukewarm coffee, a quick shower, the walk to this office, this maze of desks and silent, hunched figures. Each evening the same routine: microwave meal, a blank television screen, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the slow crawl towards another empty morning. I was adrift, a derelict boat on a calm, endless sea with no sails and no destination. Then the call came, not on the phantom phone, but on my own desk line, which rarely rang for anything beyond an internal query about a misplaced file. I almost let it go to voicemail. My hand hovered, hesitant. The ringing was sharp, insistent, cutting through the dull drone of the office. A different kind of sound. I picked it up. Seth, a voice, crisp and unfamiliar, spoke from the other end. "This is a legal representative. I'm calling regarding the estate of a distant relative." My brow furrowed. Distant relative. I had no distant relatives. My family tree had been pruned back to a single, lonely branch years ago. I confirmed my identity, my voice a dry rustle in my throat. The legal representative, a man whose voice was devoid of any warmth, continued, "It appears I am the sole surviving heir to a property, an ancestral home, if I will." He paused, and I imagined him consulting a file, a stack of yellowed papers. "Located quite remotely, I understand. In the northern reaches of the state, it's been unoccupied for some time." Unoccupied, remote, ancestral, the words hung in the air, foreign and heavy. I hadn't known I had any ancestors beyond my immediate, recently departed family. My parents had never spoken of such a place. It felt like a sudden, jarring intrusion into my carefully constructed isolation. "A home," I managed. "What kind of home?" "An older property," he replied, his tone flat. "A substantial one by the looks of the records, though I'm told it's fallen into considerable disrepair. The previous occupant, well, they simply vanished, some decades ago. No next of kin could be located until now. The local authorities have finally cleared it for transfer." Vanished. The word sent a faint shiver down my spine, a sensation I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't exactly fear, more like a cold draft in a room I thought was sealed. A property I never knew existed, belonging to a relative I never knew I had, left by someone who had simply vanished. It sounded like something out of a forgotten novel, not a chapter in my own dreary life. He gave me an address, a long, winding set of directions that led away from everything familiar, deep into a landscape of forgotten towns and winding, unpaved roads. He spoke of papers to sign, a deed to collect, a key to an old iron gate. He spoke of taxes, of liabilities, of a responsibility I never asked for, never imagined. "It's quite isolated, Mr. Seth," the legal representative reiterated as if trying to dissuade me. "No immediate neighbors. The nearest town is a good hour's drive, and as I said, it's in a state of considerable neglect, A project if I read looking for one. A project or an escape. The thought bloomed unbidden, a tiny, fragile sprout in the barren field of my mind. A chance to leave this cubicle maze, this constant hum, this stagnant air. A chance to breathe something different, even if it was the dust of an old, forgotten house. The emptiness inside me suddenly felt restless, stirred by the faint possibility of change, any change. I agreed to meet him. I agreed to sign the papers. I agreed to take possession of this inherited burden, this strange, unexpected gift. The other phone was still ringing, a ghostly echo of communication. I looked at the water stain again, no longer just a map of leaks, but a sprawling inkai blot that seemed to writhe and expand, consuming the ceiling tiles. What kind of person simply vanishes from their own home? What kind of home allows such a thing? And what would I find waiting for me there in the remote, forgotten reaches of the state? The thought, that fragile sprout, had taken root. I saw it clearly. The cubicle maze, the ceiling tiles water-stained like old maps of forgotten continents, the one phone ringing persistently in the echoing silence of a deserted office. It wasn't just a project. It was an escape hatch. I gathered my things, a small, almost ceremonial act, ignoring the curious glance from a passing colleague. The air in that building always felt recycled, stale, as if all the ambition and despair of years had been condensed and pumped back through the vents. I needed to breathe. The journey north was a slow shedding of layers. City lights thinned, then vanished, replaced by the vast, indifferent expanse of the night sky. The highway gave way to state roads, then county roads, then finally, a gravel track that seemed to unravel into the darkness. My old sedan, usually a steady companion, now rattled with an anxious energy, its headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through the encroaching wilderness. The trees grew taller, denser, their branches interlocking overhead like skeletal fingers. I felt a growing sense of remoteness, not just geographical but temporal. It was as if I was driving backward through time, leaving the modern world behind in a trail of dust. After what felt like an eternity, the gravel track widened slightly, revealing a pair of rusted, wrought-iron gates, half swallowed by overgrown ivy. Beyond them, a winding drive, barely visible beneath a canopy of ancient oaks, led into what felt less like an estate and more like a slumbering beast. My stomach clenched. This was it. It was larger than I'd imagined, much larger, sprawling and asymmetrical, a jumble of gables and turrets and bay windows that seemed to stare out with vacant, unblinking eyes. The paint had long since peeled, leaving the timber exposed in gray, weathered patches. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, burdened by an invisible weight. I killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, heavy, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, my grip tight. This wasn't the fresh start I'd envisioned, not exactly. It was more like an ending. But an ending could be a beginning, couldn't it? I pushed open the car door, the sound a jarring intrusion, and stepped out onto the overgrown drive. The air here was different, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old rust mixed with dried blood. No, that was just my imagination, a consequence of the Gothic setting. I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight beam a pathetic spear against the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light, thick as fog. A grand, sweeping staircase dominated one wall, its banister intricately carved but coated in a century of grime. The floorboards beneath my feet creaked with every step, protesting my intrusion. My voice, when I spoke, sounded thin and lost. "Hello." The word hung in the air, then was swallowed whole, leaving no echo. I moved into the first room off the hall, a drawing room perhaps, or a formal parlor. It was vast, filled with draped furniture that looked like shrouded corpses. The drapes themselves were thick with dust, heavy velvet that had once been a rich crimson but was now faded to a dull, bruised purple. A grand fireplace, black with soot, gaped like a mouth. As I walked, my shoes disturbed layers of dust, kicking up tiny clouds that sparkled in the phone's beam. I tried to shake off the growing unease. It was just an old house. A very, very old house. Of course it felt like this. It hadn't been lived in for decades, maybe longer. I moved to the next room, a dining room with a long, empty table that seemed to stretch into infinity. Here, one of the windows was completely shattered, a jagged tooth in the wall. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I spun around, sweeping the phone light across the room. Nothing. Just the draped furniture, the broken window, the dust. It must have been the wind, a trick of the acoustics in this echoing tomb. I told myself it was the wind again when I heard it a moment later, a soft scraping sound from somewhere above me, like something being dragged across a floor. My heart gave a lurch. My rational mind immediately supplied, settling of the house, old pipes, mice. But the sound had been too distinct, too rhythmic. There was I alone in this place. The cubicle maze felt like a tomb. I gathered my meager belongings, a box of personal effects that barely filled a shoebox, a faded photograph of my parents, a worn novel, a stress ball. The fluorescent lights hummed with a sickly yellow glow, reflecting off the ceiling tiles, water-stained like old maps of forgotten continents. Each stain seemed to chart a journey I was finally abandoning. My supervisor, a gruff man whose name I'd already forgotten, had offered a cursory nod. "Good luck, Seth." He'd grunted, his eyes already back on his monitor. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant, persistent ring of one phone ringing somewhere down the hall, unanswered, echoing the hollowness I'd felt for months. This wasn't just a project, it was an escape hatch. A new beginning miles from this stagnant air. I walked out without looking back, the automatic doors hissing shut behind me, severing the last tenuous thread to my old, unfulfilling life. The drive to the ancestral home was long, winding through forgotten towns and stretches of dense forest. When I finally pulled up the gravel path, the house loomed against the twilight sky, its dark silhouette both imposing and strangely inviting. It was ancient, yes, with peeling paint and sagging eaves, but it also held a certain stubborn dignity. A place with history. A place to start over. I carried my boxes inside, the air cool and smelling of damp wood and forgotten dust. Each creak of the floorboards, each sigh of the old house settling, felt less like an intrusion and more like a welcome. I spent the first few days in a determined frenzy, scrubbing grime from windows, sweeping cobwebs from high corners, trying to impose order on the chaos. The physical labor was a balm, a way to quiet the restless hum in my head. One evening, as I was wiping down the kitchen counter, I heard it. A faint whisper like dry leaves skittering across a stone path just at the edge of hearing. I paused, sponge in hand, my breath held. The house was utterly silent save for the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin in the sudden quiet. No response. I shook my head, a small, involuntary smile playing on my lips. Old houses made noises, drafts, settling foundations, mice in the walls. My imagination, probably, still a little frayed from the move and the endless scrubbing. I resumed my task, the sound fading from my mind as quickly as it had come. Later that week, while sorting through a pile of dusty books in what I was beginning to call the study, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. I whipped my head around, my neck stiffening. Nothing. Just the late afternoon light slanting through the tall windows, casting long, dancing patterns on the aged wallpaper. My eyes were playing tricks on me. Too much screen time in my previous life, perhaps. Or simply the unfamiliarity of the house, its nooks and crannies still alien to my sight. I rubbed my temples, a dull ache beginning to throb behind my eyes. I was tired, that was all. Overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the task ahead. The incidents became slightly more frequent, subtly gnawing at the edges of my rationalizations. I'd wake in the morning to find a mug I'd left on the kitchen table now sitting on the windowsill, or a book I'd been reading placed face down on the nightstand, now lying open on the floor. Each time, I'd pause, a prickle of unease rising on my arms. Had I done it myself and forgotten? Was I simply more scatterbrained than I realized? I'd tell myself that I was still adjusting, that the disarray was a symptom of my own internal chaos, not some external force. The house was old after all. Things shifted. Maybe the floor wasn't quite level and gravity was playing tricks. Not just the dry leaf rustle, but something softer, more breathy. It wasn't words, not exactly, but the implication of them. A low murmur, a faint intonation, as if someone was speaking just out of reach, just beyond understanding. I'd stop what I was doing, my skin tightening. I'd strain my ears, holding my breath until my lungs burned. I'd tell myself it was the wind whistling through a loose pane or the old pipes groaning. It had to be. One afternoon, I was in the library trying to organize the chaotic shelves. I found a small, heavy wooden box tucked away behind a row of leather-bound tomes. I pulled it out, curious, and placed it on the large, dust-covered reading table. It was intricately carved, with symbols I didn't recognize. I left it there, intending to examine it later. When I returned to the library after making myself a cup of tea, the box was gone. My stomach lurched. I searched the table, then the floor, then behind the books where I'd found it. It wasn't there. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of irritation. I wasn't losing things. I wasn't that forgetful. I had placed it right there. I stood in the middle of the library, my hands clenched. The air felt heavy, pressing in. My breath caught in my throat. My determination, which had been a solid anchor, began to fray. I walked slowly, deliberately to the window, peering out at the overgrown garden. The world outside seemed normal, oblivious. But inside, something was subtly, undeniably wrong. Was it the house, or was it me? Was I truly alone in here? One phone, somewhere in the distant rows, rang with a persistent, forlorn trill, a sound that echoed the emptiness settling in my gut. I didn't look back. There was nothing to look back at. The drive to the house was a blur of highway and winding country roads. Each mile away from the city felt like a shedding of old skin, a deliberate step into the unknown. The house, when it finally loomed into view, was just as I'd left it, a silhouette of decay against the bruised twilight sky, its windows like vacant eyes. It was still forbidding, still ancient, but now, mixed with the dread, was a strange, fierce resolve. I needed answers. I had to find out why this place felt like a living thing, breathing its cold breath down my neck. Stepping inside, the air was immediately different. Not just stale, but heavy, thick with an unseen presence. It pressed down on me, a physical weight on my chest that made each breath feel shallow. I walked through the main hall, my footsteps echoing on the dusty floorboards. The silence was profound, broken only by the creak of the house settling around me, or perhaps something else shifting within its walls. My breath plumed faintly, a ghost in the dim light. I reached out a tentative hand, my fingers brushing through the invisible pocket of frigid air. The temperature outside was mild for the season, and every window was shut tight. This wasn't a draft. This was something. But I heard no leaves. It sounded like a sigh, long and mournful, just at the edge of comprehension. I spun around, my heart racing. Nothing. I retreated, not out of fear, but a desperate need for a flicker of light. The determination I'd felt on the drive returned, sharp and clear. This wasn't going to break me. I was going to understand. I started with the basics, the house's address, its historical name, the family name I'd inherited. The internet was a vast, chaotic archive, but information on such an old, isolated property was sparse. I found old census records, property transfers, a few grainy photographs from the early 20th century showing the house looking much as it did now, only less derelict. There were vague mentions of unexplained occurrences in local forums, dismissed by most as urban legends, but a few users spoke of a heavy atmosphere and a feeling of being watched from decades ago. My attention turned to the house itself. There had to be something here, something left behind by the generations who had lived and died within these walls. I spent the next few hours methodically searching, starting with the dusty study. Old books, their spines cracked and faded, lined the shelves. I found ledgers, meticulously kept, detailing harvests and expenses from a century ago. Nothing supernatural, just the mundane records of a life lived. Then, tucked away in a false bottom of an old writing desk, I found it. A small wooden box, unmarked, its surface smooth from age. Inside, nestled among dried rose petals, were a handful of yellowed letters and a small, leather-bound diary. The script was elegant, feminine, and faded. The entries spanned only a few years, from 1888 to 1891. I opened the diary to a random page, the brittle paper crackling under my touch. The ink bled slightly, making some words difficult to decipher. It was all here, written over a century ago. The author was a woman, a previous resident. Her entries grew increasingly distraught, obsessed with a pervasive sorrow, a sense of loss that seemed to consume her. It always wants more. I can't fight it any longer. A sudden, abrupt stop. I flipped through the remaining blank pages, my fingers trembling. The letters, when I unfolded them, were written to the same woman from a sister, expressing concern, urging her to leave the house, mentioning her declining spirits and unhealthy solitude. The last letter was dated November 1891, a frantic plea for a response, followed by a note from a different hand, a lawyer's script, informing the sister of the resident's unexplained disappearance. Unexplained disappearance. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just a local legend. This house had swallowed people before. It fed on their grief, twisted their minds then. Who was she that the diarist mentioned? And what did it want more of? The silence after I read about the disappearances was a heavy wool blanket pressing in, damp and cold. My stomach twisted into a knot. It wasn't just a local legend, not some campfire tale. It fed on their grief, twisted their minds then. The cold spot in the living room seemed to intensify, a phantom chill reaching out to me even from this distant room, wrapping tendrils around my ankles. My determination, though, hadn't vanished. If anything, it solidified. I wouldn't be another name on a forgotten list. I needed answers. I needed to understand what this place truly was, what it did. I started with the most obvious sources, the remaining boxes of documents in the study, the ones I'd barely touched, overwhelmed by their sheer volume. They smelled of dust and mildew and forgotten lives. Hours blurred into a single aching span. I sifted through brittle deeds, faded photographs, and tax receipts that dated back over a century. My fingers grew stiff, coated in a fine, yellowish powder. Most of it was mundane, the financial detritus of lives lived and forgotten. But then, tucked beneath a stack of utility bills from the 1970s, I found it. A slim, leather-bound journal. Its cover was smooth and worn, the leather cracked like sun-baked earth. No name adorned the front, but the script inside was neat, precise, and undeniably old. The entries began innocently enough, detailing daily routines, observations about the weather, the cost of groceries. The handwriting was firm, almost assertive. Then a shift. The tone changed, growing melancholic, then agitated. The writer, a woman named Liminal, spoke of a growing weariness, a profound sense of isolation that had nothing to do with the house itself, but with her work. The air grows thick with stale coffee and unspoken anxieties. I see them, my colleagues, their faces mirroring my own slow decay, and yet I cannot leave. The weight of expectation, of needing to contribute, it anchors me to this desolation. I feel its tendrils reaching, even here, pulling me down. My breath hitched. The journal continued, detailing Liminal's return to this very house each evening, her attempts to find solace, only to find the weariness followed her, deepening. The entries became frantic, less coherent. I hear the children sometimes laughing, but they are not here. They are gone. It is louder than any scream. Her children, I remembered the small, faded shoes in the attic. Another loss, another anchor for the entity. Liminal's final entry was barely legible, a scrawl of despair. It wants me. It wants my emptiness. I cannot fight it anymore. It is everywhere. The date was 3 months before the utility bills ended in the stack. Her disappearance had been attributed to a simple walk into the woods, a tragic accident, the authorities concluded. No body, just like the others. The house hadn't just taken her, it had consumed her. What had she seen truly in that cubicle maze? Had the entity reached for her even there, planting the seeds of its influence? I pushed the journal away, needing to breathe. The air in the study felt heavy, suddenly too thick to draw into my lungs. My chest tightened. I stood, walked to the window. Outside, the twilight deepened, painting the skeletal branches of the trees in stark black against a bruised purple sky. This wasn't just a house. It was a mouth, a stomach, and I was inside. I tried to sleep that night, but the journal's words clung to me, a suffocating shroud. When sleep finally claimed me, it was not a release. I dreamt of a vast, empty office. Fluorescent lights hummed, their buzz a constant, low thrum against my eardrums. I was alone in a cubicle maze, ceiling tiles water-stained, one phone ringing somewhere, its shrill cry echoing endlessly. My legs were heavy, mired in something unseen, like walking through thick mud. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was everywhere. I woke with a gasp, my heart racing, slick with sweat. My breath came in ragged gasps. I sat up, clutching the sheets, the ringing. Had it been part of the dream, or had it been real? What had it wanted? Alina's words echoed in the chill of the study. It wants me, the cold. It is everywhere. The entry, barely legible, cut off 3 months before whatever terrible end she met. The date itself was a cruel, stark marker. I tried to focus on the journal to find some clue, any thread to pull. My fingers traced the faded ink, the desperate curves of her handwriting. A floorboard creaked upstairs, a sound I had come to ignore, attributing it to settling wood or the wind. Tonight it felt like a deliberate shift, a presence moving just beyond my sight, a flicker at the edge of my vision. I turned, but nothing. My eyes felt gritty, tired. I hadn't slept well since arriving, a restless cycle of half-dreams and sudden, heart-jarring awakenings. The loneliness here was a physical weight, pressing down, a constant companion. It was exactly what the entity craved, what Alina had warned against. I rubbed my temples. A dull ache throbbed behind my eyes. I needed to clear my head to separate what was real from what my exhaustion was conjuring. I pushed away from the desk, standing, stretching. The room seemed to waver, the dim light from the single lamp suddenly too bright, then too dim. The air grew heavy, like static before a storm. The familiar scent of old paper and dust vanished, replaced by something acrid, metallic, like ozone and stale coffee. My vision blurred. One moment I was standing amidst antique furniture and towering shelves. The next, the world lurched, a violent, disorienting shift. I was standing in a cubicle maze, ceiling tiles water-stained, one phone ringing. The air was frigid, dry, tasting of processed dust and something metallic. My ears rang with the relentless, shrill peal of a desk phone. It was too loud, too insistent. The maze of gray fabric walls stretched out, endless, identical. Each cubicle was a tomb holding a monitor, a keyboard, a stack of papers. A few dead, dusty plants sat forgotten on ledges. No other sound, no other human presence, just the ringing. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the alien quiet. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My study. Where was my study? I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, stuck in place. My hands, when I looked at them, were pale, almost translucent. The ringing continued, pulling me. It was the phone. The one phone ringing in this vast, sterile landscape. I stumbled forward, my feet making no sound on the thin, industrial carpet. Each cubicle I passed was empty, yet felt watched. I could almost feel the phantom weight of countless hours spent hunched over a screen, the slow draining of life. This was the antithesis of everything I had sought in the ancestral home. I reached the cubicle. The phone sat on a gray desk, vibrating with its insistent cry. A small, framed photograph lay face down beside it. My hand trembled as I reached for the receiver. Just the persistent hum of the lights. It was my mother's voice, distorted, thin, calling my name. Seth. Then my father's, a low, sorrowful sigh. Seth. Then a child's laugh, bright and fleeting, before dissolving into a choked sob. Seth. The voices were fragments, echoes of my deepest losses, twisting the knife in the fresh wound of my grief. They weren't speaking to me, they were mourning me. I slammed the receiver down, the clatter shockingly loud. My vision swam. As I spun, my gaze snagged on a monitor screen in the cubicle across from me. It was off black, but in its polished surface I saw a reflection. Not mine. It was me, but not me. Older. He sat hunched, shoulders slumped, endlessly staring at an unlit screen. His hand, frail and trembling, reached out slowly, not to me, but to the small, framed photograph on his desk. He turned it over. It was a faded picture of my family. My parents, my younger self, smiling. The man in the reflection was trapped, consumed by the very emptiness a leaner had written about. He wasn't crying for them. He was crying for me. This wasn't just an illusion. It was a premonition, a promise. The entity was showing me my future, a future where I was utterly consumed, trapped in a meaningless existence, my memories twisted into instruments of my own torture. I squeezed my eyes shut, a guttural cry tearing from my throat. No, not this. I wouldn't let it. I clawed at the air, desperate to break free, to shatter this awful vision. My hands met something solid, rough, splintered wood. I gasped, my eyes flying open. I was back in the study. The lamp glowed softly. The scent of old paper and dust filled my nostrils. The cubicle maze was gone. The ringing phone was gone. My study, solid and real, surrounded me. I was leaning against the heavy oak desk, my heart racing, sweat beading on my forehead. My hands were shaking and my entire body trembled. I looked down at the desk. My fingers, still trembling, brushed against the leather-bound journal. My eyes widened. Tucked between pages 47 and 48, pages I had already read and reread, was a small, creased piece of paper. It was a child's drawing, faded and yellowed. A stick-figure family holding hands under a lopsided sun. In the corner, a name scrawled in a child's unsteady hand, Lily. Lily, Aliner's daughter, the shoes in the attic. This drawing hadn't been there before. I knew it hadn't. My hand shook as I pulled it out. How could it be here? Was it always there and I simply hadn't seen it, or had something placed it there? And if so, what else had been altered? The drawing of Lily, clutched in my trembling hand, felt like a burning coal. My breath hitched. It hadn't been there, I knew it. Every fiber of my being screamed that truth, a primal certainty that bypassed logic. But if it hadn't been there, then how? My gaze darted around the attic, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light through the grimy window. Had I truly been so oblivious? So lost in my own head that I'd missed a child's drawing tucked inside a shoe? The thought was a cold, bitter draft, chilling me more than any spectral whisper. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to reset, to clear the lingering fog of grief and exhaustion. When I opened them, the attic seemed to shrink, the shadows deepening at the corners. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ancient wood and something else, something cloying and sweet, like wilting lilies. It clung to the back of my throat. My heart gave a frantic flutter, a trapped bird against my ribs. I descended the attic stairs, the drawing still in my hand, each creak of the old wood echoing the instability I felt within myself. This wasn't just a house. It was a labyrinth designed to confuse, to erode. The entity, whatever it was, wasn't just lurking. It was actively manipulating, twisting the threads of my reality. It wanted me to doubt myself, to believe I was losing my grip. Back in the relative normalcy of the living room, I tried to anchor myself. I placed the drawing carefully on the coffee table, next to the stack of dusty books I'd yet to open. Its bright colors seemed unnaturally vibrant against the muted tones of the room. A child's innocent artwork, now a symbol of something deeply sinister. I could almost feel eyes on me, not physical eyes, but a pervasive awareness. It watched. It learned. It knew. Later, as dusk bled purple and gray across the sky, I found myself in the kitchen, trying to force down a meal I had no appetite for. The clatter of the fork against the ceramic plate sounded deafening in the quiet. Faint, like the rustle of dry leaves against a window pane. It wasn't a word I recognized, more a sigh, a gentle caress of sound that seemed to curl around my ear. It promised understanding. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. My skin prickled. I wasn't alone, not truly. This wasn't just a house, it was a consciousness, and it was reaching out. The temperature in the kitchen dropped several degrees, the air growing heavy with a static charge. My muscles tensed, ready to bolt, but my feet felt rooted to the floorboards. It felt like a mother's touch, a lover's solace, a friend's quiet empathy. It offered a profound, aching comfort, a balm for the wounds I carried. "You don't have to be alone, Seth." The words weren't spoken, but imprinted directly onto my mind, a thought that felt both alien and intimately familiar. It was a solution, a way out of the crushing weight of loneliness that had become my constant companion since my losses. But the comfort was insidious, laced with something ancient and hungry. It was a predator offering a soft bed. My determination flared, cutting through the haze of false warmth. No, this wasn't comfort. It was a trap. It wanted me to surrender, to embrace the very despair it fed upon. I wouldn't let it. I pushed away from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. My hands shook, but my resolve was firm. I needed to connect, to hear another human voice, to remind myself what reality felt like outside these walls. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling with the cold metal. I scrolled through my contacts, the names a blur. Who could I call? Who would even believe me? A colleague from my old job. Maybe someone who knew me before all this, before the house started to fray the edges of my sanity. I found a number, a former coworker, a man named Mark, who had always been pragmatic, grounded. I pressed call, my thumb slick with sweat. The phone buzzed against my ear, a lifeline. One ring, two, three. Then the line went dead. No busy signal, no voicemail. I tried again, same result. The phone was dead. No signal. I checked the battery, full. I tried another number, then another. Nothing. Frustration boiled over, hot and bitter. I stormed through the house, searching for a landline, anything. The old rotary phone in the study was disconnected, its cord severed clean. The internet router in the living room blinked a sickly red. No service. The house was cutting me off. I paced, adrenaline surging through me. My mind raced, trying to find an alternative. I needed to get out, to drive, to find a place where the signals weren't choked, where the air didn't taste of ancient grief. I grabbed my keys, my heart racing. I had to leave, now. As I reached the front door, a faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated through the floorboards. It grew, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the house. The air grew heavy again, thicker, like breathing through wet wool. The floor beneath my feet felt strangely soft, yielding. My eyes darted around the entryway. The wallpaper seemed to ripple, the floral patterns shifting, elongating into something vaguely skeletal. Then I heard it. From somewhere deep within the house, a distant, muffled ringing. It echoed, faint but clear, from a place I hadn't explored. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get in the car and drive until the house was a speck in my rearview mirror, but the ringing. It was a sound of communication, a promise of connection. Was it a trick or a desperate plea? The sound grew slightly louder, pulling me deeper. The walls here were covered in peeling, faded paint, the floorboards groaning under my weight. I followed the sound, my heart a frantic drum. It led me to a heavy, unmarked door tucked away at the very end of the hall. I'd never noticed it before. It turned with a soft click. Beyond it lay a space I couldn't have imagined. A vast, echoing room dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging precariously from a frayed wire. It was a cubicle maze, ceiling tiles water-stained, one phone ringing. The ringing. It was coming from the center of this impossible place, a relentless, shrill summons. Who would be calling me here, and how could this place exist within the house? My breath hitched. I knew it. But if it hadn't been there, then how? My gaze darted around the attic, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light, the forgotten furniture hulking under their shrouds. The air, thick and still moments ago, now felt charged, heavy, pressing in on me. Every creak of the old house was amplified, a groan from a vast, unseen throat. I tried to force air into my lungs, but it caught, a ragged gasp. My vision blurred at the edges, the familiar lines of the attic distorting, wavering. The paper in my hand felt slick with sweat. Lily's eyes, rendered in charcoal, seemed to follow me, not with affection, but with a vacant, knowing stare. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't my imagination. This was impossible, yet it was real. The charcoal smudged against my palm, leaving a dark stain, undeniable. A cold dread seeped into my bones, a different kind of chill than the drafts of the old house. I needed to leave this place, this attic, this house. My mind screamed for escape, but my feet felt rooted to the floorboards. The drawing slipped from my fingers, fluttering silently to the dusty floor, Lily's image turning face down as if hiding from me. I stumbled backward, tripping over something unseen, my hand flailing out to brace myself against a draped wardrobe. The fabric was heavy, coarse, smelling of mothballs and decay. I pushed myself upright, my heart racing a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My breath came in shallow, desperate gasps. I had to go. My legs, stiff and reluctant, finally obeyed. I lurched towards the attic door, the narrow opening seeming to shrink as I approached it. I didn't stop to look. I couldn't. Down the steep, winding stairs I went, my steps uneven, echoing loudly in the sudden quiet of the house. I expected to find myself in the familiar hallway below, the one leading to the sitting room, but the descent seemed to stretch on, longer than I remembered. The walls, instead of the peeling floral wallpaper, were now smooth, painted a sterile, institutional beige. My hand scraped against a surface that felt like cheap industrial paneling. Where was I? This wasn't the house. It couldn't be. I pushed open a door, finding not the sitting room but a vast, disorienting space. A cubicle maze, ceiling tiles water-stained, one phone ringing. Rows upon rows of identical gray partitions stretched out before me, forming an endless labyrinth. The fluorescent lights above, some flickering, others dead, cast a sickly, yellowish glow on the worn carpet. It was a place utterly alien to the ancestral home I'd inherited, a jarring, impossible intrusion. My mind reeled. This was a dream, it had to be. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands into them until stars exploded behind my eyelids. When I opened them again, the cubicle maze remained stark and undeniable. The ringing phone, sharp and demanding, echoed off the fabric-covered walls. Ring, ring, ring. The sound was a physical presence, drilling into my skull. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the partitions, making it impossible to pinpoint. I started walking, my steps muffled by the carpet, my hand trailing along the rough fabric of the cubicle walls. The air was stale, still, smelling of old coffee and dust. My fingers brushed against a faded memo, tacked to a partition, the words blurring under my frantic gaze. I turned a corner, then another, the maze unfolding endlessly. The ringing felt closer now, then further, then closer again, playing a cruel game. It was driving me insane. I needed to make it stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I rounded another corner and saw it. A desk. A clunky beige landline phone, vibrating slightly as it emitted its piercing sound. It was on a desk piled high with yellowed papers, a half-empty mug of something long dried, and a small, framed photograph face down. My hand, slick with sweat, reached for the receiver. Every instinct screamed at me not to. Every rational thought I had left begged me to turn and run to find an exit to escape this impossible place. But the ringing was an unbearable torture, a siren call I couldn't resist. There was a pause. Then a voice. It wasn't human, not truly. It was a voice that belonged to no one, yet was terrifyingly familiar. Seth, it breathed, a sound like rustling dry leaves, yet laced with an unnerving tenderness. You're finally home. My blood turned to ice. My hand began to tremble violently. How did it know my name? What was this place? Then the voice shifted, morphing, becoming something else entirely. It was Lily's voice, sweet and clear, just as I remembered it from a lifetime ago. You miss me, don't you, Seth? You miss us. A choked sob escaped me. It wasn't Lily. It couldn't be. Her voice was too perfect, too pure. Yet underneath it, a subtle, sickening distortion like a record played at the wrong speed. It was a mockery. Then it changed again, becoming my mother's voice, weary and loving. Why did you leave us, Seth? Why did you forget? My knees buckled. The receiver slipped from my grasp, dangling by its cord, emitting a low, guttural hum. The voices, now layered, intertwined, a cacophony of lost loved ones, all speaking to my deepest, most buried grief, swirled around me. My breath hitched, caught in my throat. My vision tunneled, the flickering lights of the maze closing in, the gray walls pressing, suffocating. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real, the house. It knew everything. It had brought me here to this impossible place to tell me this impossible truth. I was trapped. Truly, irrevocably trapped. My mental defenses, those flimsy walls of denial and rationalization, shattered into a million pieces. There was no escape. Not from the house, not from the entity, and certainly not from myself. But how could a house do this? How could it know? The house had spoken to me in its own horrifying language. Not with words, but with whispers woven into the dust motes, with the cold breath on my neck, with the shifting shadows that seemed to watch. It knew my grief. It knew my loneliness, but how? How could a mere structure possess such malevolent sentience? My hands, still faintly trembling, clenched into fists. Fear was a cold, sharp blade, but a new, harder edge had formed within me. Determination. I would not be another ghost in its walls. I would not be consumed. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I would tear this place apart, brick by brick if I had to, until I understood what I was fighting. I started my search in the oldest parts of the house, the sections that felt most steeped in forgotten time. The library, a mausoleum of brittle pages and decaying leather, seemed like a logical place. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through grimy windows, each particle a silent witness to untold tragedies. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, a faint metallic tang like old blood mixed with iron that I'd learned to associate with the house's particular malice. My fingers, grimy from touching shelves and pulling open drawers, brushed against a loose panel behind a particularly dense collection of theological texts. It wasn't obvious, hidden by years of grime and the sagging weight of the shelf above. A small, almost imperceptible gap. My heart gave a frantic thump. This was it. I felt it. With a grunt, I pried it open, splinters digging into my skin. It was a journal, its cover worn smooth, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was meticulous, faded ink on fragile paper. It wasn't dated, but the language, the cursive, felt ancient. This wasn't just a journal. It was the journal. I carried it to the grand, broken-down desk in the center of the room, careful not to tear the delicate pages. As I opened it, a faint, sweet smell like dried flowers and decay wafted up. The first few entries were mundane, observations about the weather, household chores, the arrival of a new season. Then the tone shifted. Her children, too, suffered. My breath hitched. It was a predator. She detailed her desperate attempts to understand, to fight back. She spoke of ancient symbols, of rituals meant to ward off devouring spirits, but none had worked. The entity, she surmised, was not a ghost. It was far older, pre-human. A consciousness of pure despair, drawn to places of suffering like a scavenger to a corpse. This house, she realized, wasn't its origin. It was merely its most effective trap, a nexus of sorrow. It didn't just feed on grief, it cultivated it. It amplified despair, isolated its inhabitants, then when they were weak, when their will was shattered, it would consume them. Not their bodies, but their essence. Their memories, their emotions, their very soul. It became them. It lived through their suffering, adding their echoes to its own vast, ancient hunger. This wasn't some vengeful spirit. This was a psychic parasite, an emotional vampire that had existed for millennia, drawing in the broken and the lost, promising solace only to devour them whole. My own grief, my aimlessness, it had been a beacon. Suddenly, the dusty library dissolved. The heavy, musty air was replaced by the acrid scent of stale coffee and cheap disinfectant. I was standing in a familiar, horrifying place, a cubicle maze, ceiling tiles water-stained, one phone ringing. The fluorescent lights hummed with an unbearable intensity, flickering, making the pale gray walls throb. The air was frigid, yet my skin felt clammy. I could hear the distant, tinny ring of a phone, a sound that drilled into my skull, persistent, unanswered. I saw the faces of former colleagues, their expressions blank, their eyes vacant, hunched over keyboards, their lives draining away into the hum of machinery. A sense of profound, crushing futility washed over me, a loneliness so vast it choked me. This was the entity showing me my own past, the despair it had sought out, the life it had plucked me from, the one it wanted to drag me back into. This was its harvest. I gasped, stumbling backward, the journal clattering to the floor. The cubicle maze vanished, replaced by the familiar decay of the library. My vision swam. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, my teeth chattering. The air felt thin, suffocating. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to force the image of the cubicles away. It was a trick, a vision, but it felt real, too real. The journal lay open on the floor, its pages now fluttering as if stirred by an unseen breeze. I could make out a final, scrawled entry, barely legible. It takes the light, it becomes the emptiness. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't just a house, it was a stomach, and I was already inside. What did it do with the light it took? What happened when it became the emptiness? My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was a stomach. The questions echoed in the vast, still air of the decaying hall. I stood there shivering, not from cold, but from the sudden stark clarity. It fed, it consumed, and I was its next meal. But I wasn't just going to lie down and be digested. Not anymore. Not after everything I'd seen, everything I'd felt. I had knowledge now, fragmented, terrifying, but knowledge nonetheless. It craved loneliness, grief, despair. It took the light. My fight wouldn't be with fists or a weapon. It would be with defiance. I took a deep breath, the air heavy with dust and something else, something metallic and old like dried blood. My eyes scanned the oppressive shadows. The house wanted me to succumb, to give in to the suffocating weight of its history, my own losses. But what if I refused? What if I actively sought out the opposite, light? Not just metaphorical light, but actual physical light. A window, an exit, something that hadn't been swallowed whole. I pushed myself forward, moving with a desperate resolve. I passed the dining room, its table still set for a meal never eaten, the chairs slumped like forgotten guests. I avoided the parlor where the grandfather clock always seemed to tick backward. I needed to find a way out, or at least a crack, a sliver of the world beyond these walls. The front door was a joke. I'd tried it countless times, but there had to be another way. A back entrance, a basement egress, a window that hadn't been boarded up or painted over by the house's deepening gloom. I navigated the labyrinthine corridors, my hand trailing along the peeling wallpaper. The patterns shifted in my peripheral vision, the faded roses twisting into leering faces, the stripes elongating into grasping fingers. I ignored them. They were distractions, meant to pull me back into the comfortable despair. I focused on the faint, almost imperceptible shift in the quality of the air, hoping for a draft, a hint of the outside. The house, I realized, was not passive. It was alive, and it knew. It sensed my shift, my newfound purpose. The temperature dropped, a sudden sharp plunge that stole the breath from my lungs. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned, not like old wood settling, but like a beast stirring from an uneasy slumber. I pressed on, turning a corner into what I thought was the service wing, a part of the house I hadn't thoroughly explored. I felt a prickle of hope, perhaps a cellar door, a route to the outside. Then the floor under my feet vibrated, not a tremor but a resonant hum like a distant generator. The light, already dim, flickered, stretching and shrinking like an asthmatic breath. I stumbled, catching myself on a wall that felt suddenly slick with unseen moisture. The earthy smell intensified, mingling with something acrid, chemical. My stomach twisted. The corridor ahead of me didn't look right. It was too uniform, too structured. The walls, instead of wallpaper, were a dull, industrial gray. The floor was linoleum, cracked and yellowed. My eyes struggled to adjust, my mind refusing to accept what it was seeing. I was still moving forward, but the house around me was dissolving, reforming. Fluorescent lights, some flickering, some dead, hummed above me. They cast a sickly, jaundiced glow on a landscape of low, fabric-covered walls. Beige, gray, muted blue. It wasn't the house, it couldn't be. But the transition had been seamless, terrifyingly so. No doors, no hallways, just a sudden, sickening shift in reality. My breath hitched. This place. I knew this place, or one like it. The endless rows of identical desks, the cheap modular furniture, the stale coffee smell that clung to everything. This was the antithesis of the wild, untamed decay of the house. This was the sterile, soul-crushing monotony of my previous life. The place where I had sat for years, watching the clock, feeling the slow erosion of my spirit. The entity didn't just twist the house, it twisted me. The phone kept ringing. One specific phone, a dull gray model on a desk barely visible behind a partition. Its insistent electronic chirping was a torment, a summons. My hands began to tremble. This wasn't just a trap, it was a personal hell. The house knew my vulnerabilities, my deepest fears. It wasn't just feeding on general despair, it was feeding on my despair. I took a tentative step forward, my shoes squeaking on the linoleum. The ringing stopped for a moment, then started again, louder, closer. It was coming from my old cubicle, the one I had occupied before the inheritance, before the house. It hadn't just brought me here, it had brought it here. My past, my failure, my slow, agonizing slide into nothingness. What did it want me to answer? Not from the cold, but from the chilling realization that my own despair had become sustenance. The house, this ancient, sprawling maw, wasn't just a tomb for forgotten lives. It was an active predator, and I, in my grief, had walked right into its gaping mouth. The air in the hall thickened, growing heavy like a blanket soaked in stagnant water. My skin prickled. The shadows, once merely deep, began to writhe. They stretched, elongated, then snapped into impossible angles, forming walls where none had been. The grand, decaying architecture of the hall dissolved, melting at the edges of my vision, replaced by something utterly alien, yet disturbingly familiar. Suddenly, I was standing in a cubicle maze, the ceiling tiles water-stained and sagging, a sickly yellow fluorescent hum vibrating through the air. The smell of stale coffee and cheap toner assaulted me. My breath hitched. How? The walls around me were low partitions, covered in a coarse industrial fabric, gray, then beige, then gray again. They stretched in monotonous rows, creating narrow canyons that led nowhere and everywhere. The air, thick with the phantom scent of forgotten paperwork and microwave popcorn, pressed in on me. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot by an invisible force. My throat tightened. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Then it started, a faint, insistent chirping from somewhere deep within the maze. Ring, ring, ring. One phone ringing. It echoed down the plastic corridors, a singular, piercing demand for attention. My gaze snapped towards the sound, trying to pinpoint its source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied summons. The sound grated on my nerves, a relentless assault on the fragile peace I tried to cultivate in my mind. Each ring hammered at my skull, a dull ache blooming behind my eyes. The entity was here in this fabricated space, twisting my memories, my anxieties, this place. It felt like a nightmare I'd had once, a recurring fear of being trapped in a life I didn't choose, slowly suffocating under the weight of meaningless tasks. It was the essence of my past aimlessness, distilled and weaponized. The ringing grew louder, closer, the sound vibrating in my chest. My hands balled into fists, nails digging into my palms. You are nothing. You always were. This is your truth. This is your end. My skin crawled. It wasn't just feeding on my despair, it was trying to become it. To wear my skin, to inhabit my life, to live out my deepest fears. The house wasn't just a stomach, it was a shapeshifter, an identity thief. The phone continued its relentless clamor. Ring. It was a siren song to surrender, a call to give up, to let the emptiness consume me entirely. I could feel my resolve waver, the edges of my perception blurring. The cubicle walls seemed to close in, their beige fabric turning black, absorbing all light, all hope. My muscles tensed, a desperate, futile effort to push back against the crushing weight of the illusion. But then a flicker, a tiny spark in the encroaching gloom. It wasn't a memory of warmth or comfort, but of defiance. A stubborn, hot ember of anger. Anger at being manipulated. Anger at having my grief weaponized. This wasn't my truth. It was a lie the entity wanted me to believe. My life, my choices, my sorrow, they were mine, not its. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sterile, suffocating vision of the cubicle maze, the insistent, demanding phone. I wouldn't answer its call. I wouldn't surrender. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about retaining myself, my very essence. I opened my eyes. The cubicle walls were still there, the phone still ringing, but something had shifted. The air, though still heavy, no longer felt entirely suffocating. A thin, almost imperceptible line of resilience had appeared within me. The entity wanted me to believe I was nothing, but I was something. I was Seth. I was here, and I refused to become its next costume. My jaw clenched. I wouldn't let it wear my face. I wouldn't let it speak with my voice. But how did you fight an enemy that wasn't flesh and blood, an enemy that wanted to steal your very being? The phone continued its relentless, tinny shriek. It wasn't the antique rotary from the house. This was a modern ring, sharp and grating, slicing through the thick silence that had swallowed me whole. My skin still crawled, a phantom sensation of something trying to peel me open where my very essence. I was standing, or so it felt, in a place that wasn't the house, yet felt just as suffocating. A vast expanse of gray and beige stretched before me, a cubicle maze, ceiling tiles water-stained, fluorescent lights humming a sickly, flickering tune above. The air tasted of dust and stale coffee, a metallic tang of forgotten ambition. Each cubicle wall, covered in a cheap, scratchy fabric, seemed to lean in, pressing the space smaller, tighter. My breath hitched. This was new. This was different, but it wasn't less terrifying. It was a new kind of trap, a sterile, soul-crushing void designed to replicate the slow death of identity. The phone rang again. It echoed, bouncing off the fabric walls, impossible to pinpoint. But I knew its source, or at least its intent. It was calling me, luring me deeper into this manufactured purgatory. The entity wasn't just an ancient evil tied to the house. It was a master of psychological warfare. It was showing me a different kind of despair, a mundane, everyday consumption of the soul. I started walking, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the thin carpet. Each turn in the maze looked identical to the last. Empty desks, monitors powered off, chairs pushed in. A ghost office. I understood it now. It didn't just want my grief, it wanted me. It wanted to replace Seth, to become the despair-eaten husk that once was me. And if it could do that, it could control the house and everything within it. The ringing grew louder, sharper, as I navigated the labyrinth. It came from a specific cubicle, I realized, the sound now piercing, demanding. I pushed past the last divider, the flimsy material scraping against my sleeve. There it was. A gray desk, an old, clunky landline phone vibrating violently, its receiver bouncing in its cradle, and beside it a framed photograph. My hand trembled as I reached for it. It was a picture of my parents, smiling, younger, vibrant. "They're gone, Seth. I read alone, always alone. This is my life now. The endless maze, the forgotten faces." My vision blurred. Tears stung my eyes, hot and sudden. It was twisting the knife, using the most profound grief I carried. It was trying to anchor me to this feeling, to this manufactured reality, to drown me in the very despair it craved. This was the event. It wasn't a physical struggle, but a war for my mind, for my emotional core. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the wave of self-pity, the crushing weight of what it was showing me. It wasn't real. Not this place. Not this phone. Not this immediate moment of despair, even if the root of it was real. I opened my eyes. The phone was still ringing. A low hum like 1,000 insects vibrated through the floorboards. It was angry. My defiance was a poison to it. I looked at the phone, then at the photo. The entity needed me to believe this was my fate, to willingly surrender to the endless loop of grief and isolation. That was its power. It didn't physically harm me. It dismantled me from the inside. It wasn't just feeding on my despair. It was feeding on my acceptance of that despair. It needed me to choose to be consumed. The house, this maze, it was all an elaborate stage. If I refused to play the victim, if I refused to internalize the identity it was trying to force upon me, then it starved. Its connection to me, to the house itself, was predicated on my surrender. My grief was its nourishment, but my will was its weakness. My hand still clutched the photograph. I stared at my parents' faces, not through the lens of loss, but through the lens of memory, of love. They wouldn't want me to give up, not anymore. I placed the photograph face down on the desk. The ringing phone suddenly went silent, a jarring absence of sound. The silence was heavier than the noise had been. It was trying to intimidate me, to show me its true, terrifying scale. I stood my ground, my legs trembling, but my resolve hardening. It was a manifestation of my fear, a projection of its hunger. I had to starve it. The cubicle walls around me began to vibrate, a low rumble that grew into a frantic shaking. Dust rained down from the ceiling tiles. The entire maze seemed to be convulsing, trying to shake me apart, trying to make me run, to make me doubt, but I wouldn't. I couldn't. If it needed my acceptance, then my rejection was its bane. But could I truly sever its connection to the house from within this mental prison? Or was this just the beginning of a far greater struggle? The entire maze seemed to be convulsing, trying to shake me apart, and I braced myself against the flimsy partition, my grip tight. The air crackled, not with electricity, but with something far older, far more hungry. It felt like reality itself was being stretched thin, groaning under an unbearable weight. Dust, thick and acrid, rained down from the water-stained ceiling tiles, gritty against my tongue, stinging my eyes. I choked, a ragged cough tearing through my throat, but I kept my gaze fixed on the shadowy form. It pulsed, contracting and expanding, a gaping maw of nothingness that seemed to swallow the light around it. It wanted me. I knew that with a certainty that transcended fear. It wanted to consume the last vestiges of my hope, my will, myself. It had fed on my grief, my isolation, my despair, twisting every memory, every thought into a weapon against me. But something had shifted. The sheer, overwhelming audacity of its presence, the raw, unbridled malice had ignited a spark within me. Not courage, not exactly, but a desperate primal refusal to surrender. No, I rasped, the words swallowed by the cacophony of groaning wood and tearing plaster. The cubicle walls around me shrieked, bending inward, then snapping back with violent force. A sharp crack echoed from above, and a section of ceiling tile detached itself, crumbling into powder before it hit the floor. The shaking intensified, a frantic, bone-rattling tremor that vibrated through my teeth. My knees buckled, but I fought to remain upright, clinging to the flimsy desk, my muscles screaming. The shadowy form lunged, or rather, expanded towards me, a wave of frigid air that stole my breath. I felt a pressure in my skull, a crushing weight, as if it was trying to squeeze my thoughts out, to flatten my mind into a thin, palatable paste. It was trying to drown me in my own sorrow, to make me want to be absorbed. But this time I pushed back. I clenched my jaw, gritted my teeth, and focused on the anger, the sheer bloody-minded defiance that had been simmering beneath the surface of my grief. It wasn't a noble emotion, but it was mine. It wasn't despair. "You won't have me," I snarled, the words tasting like ash. "Not all of me." The entity paused, a subtle ripple in its form, as if my defiance had been a physical blow. The pressure in my head eased, then returned with renewed ferocity, a wave of pure agony. My vision blurred, spots dancing before my eyes. I felt a searing pain, like something was being torn from my very core, a part of my consciousness being ripped away. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound that was lost in the din. Then, through the chaos, through the grinding of the maze and the tearing of unseen fibers, I heard it. A faint, persistent sound. Ring, ring, ring. Asterisk, it was the phone. The one phone isolated in the vastness of the cubicle maze, ringing relentlessly. It was real, a thread, however thin, to something outside of this manufactured nightmare. It was a desperate, foolish act, but I wasn't thinking. I was reacting. My fingers, instead of passing through nothing, met resistance. Not solid, but like plunging into a thick, viscous tar. The entity recoiled, a low, guttural shriek that scraped against my eardrums, echoing deep within my bones. The cubicle maze seemed to shudder, then convulse violently, as if a great beast was in its death throes. Walls buckled, plaster exploded, and a deafening roar erupted from the depths of the structure. I was thrown backwards, my head slamming against something hard, sharp pain blossoming behind my eyes. When I came to, the shaking had stopped. The roaring had ceased. I lay sprawled on what remained of the floor, dust clinging to my eyelashes, my mouth dry and tasting of grit. My body ached, every muscle protesting, but I was alive. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy, my head throbbing. Or rather, it was utterly annihilated. The water-stained ceiling tiles hung in ragged shreds, revealing the skeletal beams of the house above. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of weak, gray light filtering through a newly formed hole in the roof. The air was thick with the smell of decay, damp earth, and something metallic like old blood vanished. But I felt its lingering presence, a cold spot in the air, a whisper at the edge of my hearing. It hadn't been defeated, not truly. It had merely retreated, wounded perhaps by my refusal to be consumed by that spark of defiant anger. It had been starved for a moment of the very despair it craved. I staggered to my feet, my legs wobbly beneath me. The house was a ruin, even more so than before. The structural integrity, already precarious, seemed utterly compromised. I was surrounded by wreckage, a testament to the battle I had just fought, or perhaps the battle I had merely survived. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the grit of dust, the dampness of sweat, the tremor in my fingers. My mind felt different, sharper in some ways, but also brittle, like fine glass. The lines between reality and illusion, already blurred, now felt permanently erased. The world felt thin, permeable. The entity had left its mark, burrowed deep into the recesses of my consciousness. I made my way through the wreckage, picking my way over fallen beams and splintered debris. The ringing had finally stopped. I reached the outer edge of what had been the maze, stepping into a part of the house I barely recognized. A grand hall now choked with fallen masonry and dust. I had survived. I had pushed it back. But as I looked at my trembling hands, at the dust-caked wreckage around me, I wondered if I had truly won. Or if, by surviving, I had merely condemned myself to a different kind of haunting. What part of me had been taken? And what, if anything, remained to be consumed?